Hello, everyone. I'm Hal Levy at payment.com once again, and I am joined today by Corey Bond, Senior Product Manager at Form 3, and we're discussing interoperability, real-time payments, RTP, FedNow, all things that are going faster. Nice to have you. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Hal. It's great to be here. Appreciate you having me.
So real-time payments. The promise is there, the reality of getting to full potential is something different because now there's FedNow on the scene. RTP has been around for quite a number of years, and here domestically in the U.S., there remains the challenge of bridging the gap between the two different systems. What is the benefit, in your words, of interoperability? Why should we have it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that interoperable schemes could expedite the overall pace of growth for instant payments in the US, specifically the ability to have a given payment start on one rail, so RTP, for example, and end or settle on FedNow. There are and will be scenarios where a bank is enabled on one payment scheme and not another. So to have those rails interoperate in this way could be extremely useful. Ultimately, I think the expectation with instant payments is that they are frictionless, and it's really all about the end user, right? So at the end of the day, people who are not payment geeks shouldn't care or know about RTP or FedNow, which rail it's settling. They ultimately just care that their payment will get to who it needs to go to. I'm actually reminded of the scenario related to cell phones, where in the early days, if you were a Verizon subscriber, for example, you couldn't call someone that was on the AT&T network, and so that was very painful customer experience. And I think to get to the user experience that we all needed, that we all wanted in a cell phone provider, and to gain full adoption, those providers all had to interoperate. The other thing I would say to just why is this important? Why is this important in the US? I think the simple answer is that we are all accustomed to systems operating in this way. More importantly, and crucially, though, I think that banks are designed to function in this way. So said differently, banks haven't historically had to put so much focus on the concern where the recipient of a given instant payment is not subscribed to that payment rail. And ultimately, it doesn't necessarily make it right, but all our current payment types have at least two rails. And with that, the ability to start on one and end on the other.
Your point is a great one. The parallel with what went before with mobile phones and networks. Um, uh, the problem lies, I think, when we think about interoperability. And you said, you don't have to be a payment geek to necessarily know why it's needed. But let's delve a little bit into some of the intricacies here. Why aren't the rails themselves uh, able to be not well, they coexist, but why aren't they interoperable now? What are the problems that are there? What are the challenges? And how do you start to think about addressing that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think that adoption and subscription to the current instant payment rails by banks, right? That's a key challenge. The reality is that RTP started first, and this was about 5 or 6 years ago. They had a bunch of experience and learnings, and FedNow solution, of course, came after middle of the year, last year, 2023. There were obvious constraints in how far they could adjust things to truly interoperate, not only the technical challenges of trying to interoperate a real-time settlement scheme. I think there are also two types of interoperability, right? So if you think about Fedwire and chips as an example, they have message routing interoperability, but they also don't necessarily interoperate in the way that we mean here. So for example, a given transaction starting on one payment rail and ending on another. So the model does exist today. I think maybe thinking beyond the scheme specific challenges or the payment rail specific challenges, there is also the adoption challenge in general. So a number of banks have and continue to adopt kind of a wait and see approach. And I think the rollout of FedNow last year has certainly expedited that growth. and hopeful that the trend will continue through 2024 and beyond.
If we start to think about the ways in which, let's call it adoption, start to scale, the banks, the rails themselves are able to be used a bit more easily. If we
Yeah.
start to think about the use cases for faster payment as they exist now and where they might emerge and evolve with an interoperable functionality,
Yeah.
what would we start to see? What's the natural progression to your mind that we would see? RTP has been around for a while, so we already have some indication. We have some history. What's already out there? What's going to emerge? And what would you actually start to think might be pushed to customers from the banks?
So I do think first and foremost, it's going to be a critical factor in driving this network effect that will ultimately enable more endpoints to be reached. I think the challenge that we have now, from my perspective at least, is that there is a mix of reluctance and or major challenges for banks with the ability to support a 24/7, 365 processing, posting, settlement, et cetera, infrastructure. And when you couple that with banks who are selectively and for various reasons choosing which payment rail, so RTP or FedNow, it can limit the overall adoption and that network effect that we ultimately need to accomplish. I think there's a scenario where the value proposition for service providers, such as Form 3 is my employer, where it really stands out, specifically solving the interoperability concern for those banks and ultimately taking that burden away. Here at Form 3, we offer US instant payment. So it's a combination of RTP and FedNow. And we've intentionally built the solution such that RTP and FedNow would be transparent to the bank. So in this case, the bank isn't having to wait for the Fed and TCH to solve for the particular concern. We've already done that as have other, providers in this particular space.
You've said a few times reluctance is sort of out there. Is it a reluctance based on in part on fears of fraud? Is it a reluctance worried about, look, there's an operational sea change that has to take place, right? Batch processes now go away,
Yeah,
kind of. Um, and there has to be a cultural mind shift for the providers themselves.
sure.
Plus, you may offer a use case, it may not be adopted. So, with all of those concerns out there, I wonder if you can give an idea of um, what lessons have been learned from RTP, again, out there for a few years. But now, as we're having this conversation, a few months old. Let's talk a little bit about the reluctance and worries over transparency and fraud. And then let's talk a little bit about the ways in which you might see some reassurance on those two things. And if we think about what the tech challenges that get solved are, how do you think FedNow and RTP might become viewed as a seamless construct? It almost doesn't matter where the payments are originating, ending, and even flowing. So, how do you address the reluctance and fears of faster fraud? How do you address the cultural mind shift of the banks? And
Yeah.
then, will we ever get to a seamless end-to-end?
Yeah, so I'll take a pass at it. I think if I had the fantastic answer, we would certainly see a lack of reluctance, right, in terms of banks and their willingness and ability to ultimately move forward. But look, I think that banks have warranted concerns, viable concerns as it relates to what is this going to look like. I know we didn't spend a whole lot of time, Hal, on any sort of introductions, but prior to joining Form 3, I spent roughly 19 years of my career at Wells Fargo. And so I can certainly understand and appreciate a lot of the concerns that they now, at the time had as it relates to what does this infrastructure look like? What are all of the concerns? You mentioned some of the regulations and some of the, scheme specific requirements are also of concern. And so as you think about how your organization operates today. What does my operation shop look like? Do I have staffing to support 24/7? What is the fraud landscape? I think these are certainly viable concerns that banks have and is kind of fueling their reluctance to move forward in these instant payment schemes. Um, a lot of productivity, I think, made in the way of fraud and how banks can go about thinking about that particular concern. There's a lot of you know industry work happening in the space as well to figure out as fraudsters get a little bit more sophisticated and intelligent around how to infiltrate the instant payment schemes. How do we combat those? So I know that there are a lot of work groups, et cetera, working through some of those challenges as well. To the concern around, RTP and FedNow, kind of working together, what are the lessons learned? I think that in a lot of ways, RTP has set the stage for what a world of instant payments could look like. I think they've shown us what to do as it relates to instant payments, but I also think there have been some lessons learned, and they would probably be the first to admit, right, that there were some things that haven't worked as well. We've needed to make a few tweaks throughout the process, but they have shown the power of instant payments in the US. I think they've proven the value to a number of use cases as well. Obviously, with FedNow now live and doing very well in terms of adoption, I believe we're going to continue to see that interest and that adoption grow even more. The reality is that competition has always driven a market, especially in the US. And so having those two rails in place will hopefully accelerate things also. FedNow obviously has been able to take advantage of those lessons learned from RTP and suspect there will be a continued evolution of schools of thought, additional lessons learned now with both rails in place that we'll be able to leverage and move forward in a collaborative way.
When we talk about interoperability, you and I have been discussing domestic interoperability. Um, Around the world, there's several dozen real-time payment schemes that have already taken shape. Um, there's an eventual goal of having those regional or countrywide systems link up with one another so that cross-border real-time payments become much more a reality. Is it your thought that the domestic interoperability needs to be firmly cemented here, maybe and has to prove itself before we start to see a link up from the US with other real-time payment schemes around the world? And if so, what would the role of standardized messaging, ISO, obviously, um, be here? And what would the actual critical mass be before we start to see interoperability beyond these borders?
Yeah, so I'll maybe take that in two parts. One being just kind of my perspective, and then I'll also share where I think Form 3 in particular has a unique perspective given how the company started and kind of what they're already doing from a cross-border perspective today. So I don't, I guess, back to your first question, I don't necessarily think that things need to be firmed up and cemented 100% in the US or domestically before there is an opportunity to play in the cross-border space. I think certainly making additional strides toward that, and again, knowing that there are service providers who have kind of solved that concern for banks that are willing to leverage it will certainly help. But as we think about, again, Form 3 and the fact that, 8 years ago now, Form 3 started in the UK, there's, 45-ish% of the faster payments volume already taking place. There's been an expansion in the European market as well, from a SEPA instant perspective. And so you kind of already see these various flavors of the potential for cross-border transactions, which again, as we think about interoperability, if a customer had the ability to leverage a single set of APIs, pointing to RTP, pointing to FedNow, pointing to FPS in the UK, other markets, that will ultimately have some level of expansion. You've solved not only the interoperability concern, but also the ability to move across markets. And for a customer perhaps that's global, that's an ideal scenario. And so I think that there is opportunity, again, both domestically and internationally, and interoperability is going to fuel from it, whether it's a use case perspective or a given market, it's going to fuel the ability to um, allow different use cases, different business cases to be fulfilled, leveraging that.
What have I missed that we haven't touched on, or that you'd like to point out in your own? As you said, you've had experience on both sides of the equation, right? So you've been in the sector in banking. You've certainly got a, ground level view here at Form 3 of RTP potential. So what would you like to leave us with as we exit this conversation about interoperability where we are right now? What do you think is going to be maybe a landscape a year or a few years from now, and what should we be thinking about next?
Yeah, so I would just add perhaps to the kind of the breadth of conversation we've had thus far. We know that there are tech challenges. I shared about my experience with Wells Fargo. The last several years with the firm was specifically actually focused on the build of RTP and FedNow for the commercial bank and the corporate and investment bank. And one of the key challenges to building out those solutions did center around the different specifications between the two schemes or the payment rails, the technical requirements, there were regulatory concerns, and all of this all under the umbrella of trying to ensure that this did not look like two separate products. It did not look like two separate payment rails. And I'll highlight again just the criticality that banks seek out providers such as Form 3 that can absorb the burden on a bank's behalf. We've taken it a step further to implement, to build capabilities such as account validation and stand-in, which would allow Form 3 to stand in on behalf of customers for the receipt of their instant payment transactions. And so as you think about banks that say, hey, I'm not available on the weekends, or I can't truly be available 24/7, 365. And so you have that, again, in a provider that can assume or accept those transactions on your behalf. I think that kind of thinking beyond, looking forward, continued engagement with the Fed and TCH on message compatibility. I think this ultimately sets the industry up for directory capabilities. This is going to set the industry up for interoperability, which could then drive P2P initiation, alias-based payments, and really just a tremendous opportunity in this space. And I think interoperability will drive some significant progress forward in the agenda of instant payments.
No, great. Thanks for leaving us with those use cases. P2P is an interesting area. The aliases obviously are emerging and have their value. Thank you very much for the look ahead. And for the next time that we meet, I think we might take stock of where we saw some of this progress. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Hal.